Speaker. Madam Speaker, I also rise today to speak on the proposed extension of the First Homeowners Grant Act for another year. Madam Speaker, almost exactly a year ago, I stood in this place and spoke on this bill when it was first introduced, and at that time raised concerns about whether first home buyer grants actually do make housing more affordable, or whether they risk inflating housing prices by enabling buyers to meet higher prices rather than addressing the underlying causes of housing inequality, lack of supply. So years passed and we're now being asked to extend this scheme for another 12 months. And Madam Speaker, let me be clear, I absolutely support whatever will work towards addressing our housing crisis, towards building our population, towards building our economy. And if this scheme is genuinely helping Territorians into homes and building our housing supply, then I absolutely want to see it continue. But my concerns from a year ago remain, and before we extend this policy, I believe Territorians deserve answers about whether or not it is actually achieving what this chamber hoped it would. So what have we gained from the scheme? And we've heard a lot about this in the chamber today. We know that it's cost Territorians at $200 million in its first year, which is a significant investment of public money, particularly given our current economic situation. So what I'm interested in is what we have gained in the Territory from spending that $200 million. Has this scheme actually built our population in any meaningful way? Has it actually stimulated our economy? Has it made house prices go up? Has it had an impact on our housing crisis, on homelessness, on the lack of affordable rental options, and on the shortage of social housing? Madam Speaker, I believe when we're passing laws, we need to see the data and the evidence, because if this scheme is working, that evidence will show us we're on the right track. And if it's not working as intended, then we need to adjust our approach. I want to be clear, I asked exactly these questions in the briefing I intended on this bill, and the answer I was given is that no, we do not have that data yet. When I asked explicitly how many new homes are being built because of this scheme, how many additional homes would not exist without this investment, I was told we do not have the data currently to show that this bill is achieving what it's set up to do. Madam Speaker, I absolutely celebrate more people in work, more people in housing, more people in the Northern Territory, but when we're spending Territorians' money, we must spend it in ways that we know will work. Today we're voting on extending a $200 million scheme, and we've heard lots of talk in this chamber about how it is working, but we don't actually have that data. So the questions I ask again are, how many additional homes have been built or are being built that would not have been built otherwise? What impact has this scheme had on house prices? What impact has it had on the construction sector and on building costs? Has it actually increased our population in any meaningful way? Has it genuinely stimulated our economy, or is it simply subsidising what would have happened already? And what impact, if any, has it had on our broader housing challenges? Without this evidence, Madam Speaker, we're asking Territorians to trust us with their money while flying blind. That's not good enough when families can't find homes and our housing crisis deepens. Madam Speaker, I do want to acknowledge that the government's not extending the $10,000 established home grant. That grant essentially paid people to move from one house to another, putting nothing into the Northern Territory economy, creating no new housing supply, and simply shuffling existing residents of the Northern Territory, and in the case of the 30K grant, people who have owned a home before, simply shuffling them around and inflating prices for everyone else. I think the decision not to extend that component is sensible, and I acknowledge it. But, Madam Speaker, that makes the question even more important. If the established home grant wasn't effective enough to continue, what evidence do we have that the new home grant is achieving better results? I'm not asking for what assurances we have from government members. I'm asking for measurable outcomes to housing affordability, housing ownership, the economy and population growth. Once again, the fundamental question that we need to answer is how many additional homes are being built or have been built that would not have been built otherwise. As I said, I asked this in the briefing and I was told the government will be evaluating that in the future. But Madam Speaker, measuring after the fact is not accountability. We need to know whether this scheme is actually making a difference or whether we're simply handing taxpayer money to developers for projects that they were going to build anyway. Madam Speaker, when I spoke on this bill a year ago, I raised concerns based on the evidence from decades of similar schemes around Australia. Between 1965 and 2021, Australian governments spent more than $38 billion on cash grants for first home buyers and $9.4 billion on stamp duty concessions. And yet during this time, home ownership rates steadily declined and house prices skyrocketed, far out of reach of regular Australians. I also pointed to more recent examples like the Morrison government's home builder program, which created a sudden surge of demand for builders and building materials, and without a corresponding increase in builders and materials, this pushed up costs across the construction sector, making new builds less affordable, not more. And critically, these price increases also affected industries beyond the construction industry dependent on similar materials, actually making life far harder for small business owners and for their employees. Madam Speaker, a year later, these concerns remain. And I genuinely want to know, has the experience here been different? Are we making it work better here? How can we have confidence that this scheme is working better here than it has worked in other places? Madam Speaker, I understand the intent behind this bill. I share the government's commitment to improving housing affordability and helping Territorians into homes. We also must ensure we're addressing the full spectrum of housing need in the Northern Territory, including homelessness, lack of affordable rental options and limited social housing. My question is not whether or not we should help first home buyers. Of course we should support Territorians to own their own home. My question is this the most effective use of $200 million or now $100 million we're being asked today to address our housing needs, or whether there are complementary approaches that we should be pursuing alongside this scheme so that we don't just inflate house prices and therefore intensify the problem. Investing in social housing, for example, makes economic sense. We know that every dollar spent on building new social housing does stimulate the local economy and create jobs, and it reduces the long-term cost to the health and to the justice system. By providing affordable, stable housing, we reduce pressure on emergency services, homelessness services and the health system. And Madam Speaker, these approaches are not mutually exclusive. It's not an either or. We can support first home buyers while also investing in social and affordable housing. But to do that, we need to understand what's working and what isn't and why. We can't just rely on wishful thinking when these policies affect everyone. Madam Speaker, I'm not asking the government to abandon this scheme. I'm asking for transparency about its effectiveness today when we're making the decision to commit to another year and another $100 million of Territorians' money. Madam Speaker, as I've said, I support genuinely addressing our housing crisis. I want to see Territorians in secure, affordable homes, whether they're renting, whether they're in social housing, or whether they're buying or building their own home. Like other people in this chamber, I'm absolutely committed to building our community, to have people staying here in the Northern Territory, to support workers and to build our economy. And Madam Speaker, I want to make sure that if we're doing that and we're with the significant public investment we're making is actually achieving the outcomes that we all want to see. Thank you, Madam Speaker.